Everybody. So what I want to do with this video is provide a brief overview of the ways that African Americans' lives were changed or affected by the American Revolution, as well as the ways that American slavery as an institution began to change in the years following the American Revolution. So what we're going to start doing now this week is transitioning from talking about colonial slavery, right? Slavery in the North American colonies that were under the dominion of Great Britain, as well as the sort of early transatlantic slave trade. And that's a period when many enslaved people were coming directly through the transatlantic slave trade from Africa into the North American colonies, or they were coming from the Caribbean, but they weren't sort of a naturally reproducing population. Once we move into the history of the United States, right, the history after the Revolution, that story begins to change. So this is a period. There's sort of different names for the period that we're going to be discussing today. If you're talking generally about American history, about the sort of entire history of the country, folks might call it the early national period, which makes sense, right? It's the beginning of the nation. When you're zooming in on the history of slavery and you're thinking about the experiences of African Americans in particular, you might call this the middle period in American slavery. And it's sort of a transitionary phase away from the older models, and I'll talk about sort of what those were in a second, just quickly summing them up, that are largely based in the tobacco plantations of Virginia or the rice plantations of South Carolina, towards cotton-based slavery in what we today think of as the Deep South, in that lower Mississippi Valley, around Mississippi and Louisiana, etc. This is a absolutely pivotal moment in the history of American slavery. It's an era when the United States, of course, became a nation, but also became a nation that was completely dependent on slave labor as the sort of foundation of its economy. And it's an era when slavery solidified connections between this really vast, really diverse region that stretched from, and continues to stretch from, about Baltimore, Maryland, all the way down to Texas, right? This is a huge region that we think of as the South, right? This is a place that encompasses the cotton plantations around Memphis or New Orleans, the tobacco factories of Richmond. All of these places become economically and politically linked in this period, and that's how they can have a kind of single regional identity like the South. So it's only, just to sum that idea up, it's only after the American Revolution that slavery in the South really became truly synonymous. And even then, the story is somewhat complicated, as I'm going to show in a few minutes. Prior to the Revolution, the 13 colonies were either all slave societies or societies with slaves. But after the Revolution, northern colonies begin a long process of ending slavery, and slavery expands in both its size and its power and influence in the South at the same time. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of what actually happened. Of course, the central event in the middle period of American slavery was the American Revolution. By the time of the Revolution, slavery had existed in North America for more than 150 years, which means that it was absolutely central to the events of the Revolution, right? It was a deeply embedded institution everywhere in the colonies. So when we often tell the history of the Revolution through a white perspective, we think of the idea of like patriots in places like Concord, Massachusetts, or Saratoga, New York, or something like that. We usually have a white face that's in mind based on sort of popular tellings of the history of the Revolution. In fact, African Americans were completely central to the events of the Revolution, and their lives were profoundly affected by it, right? The Revolution was not simply the story of white people in North America and white people in Great Britain having a sort of theoretical disagreement about the scope and nature of government, right? This is an event that brings in all of the people on the continent, and affects all of their lives, including the enslaved people. So, how did the revolution affect African Americans? Let's think about a few specific ways. For one, um, the revolution brought with it what some historians have called a contagion of liberty. What they mean by that was that uh, political leaders' embrace of ideas of liberation, of revolution, of freedom against tyranny, spread through American society in ways that those original sort of speakers or writers had not intended. So it acted like a contagion, which is a fitting metaphor for our lives now, right? And that sort of rhetoric of liberty and freedom really inspired many African Americans, including many enslaved people, to protest their own bondage, right? They adopted that language, but instead of sharing um, much of the white population's attitude towards Great Britain, they turned the language of liberty, the rhetoric of liberty, against slave masters. As one group of African American petitioners in Massachusetts put it, how could America seek release from English tyranny and not seek the same for disadvantaged Africans in her midst? Right? Pointing out the hypocrisy of maintaining slavery while asking for political freedom from Great Britain. Hoping to advance their cause, roughly 5,000 African Americans supported the revolutionary military effort. Rhode Island and Connecticut created all-black military units, and Rhode Island enlisted 250 enslaved people and emancipated them as a result of their service in the war effort. Other parts of the 13 colonies were not nearly as generous. And that's obviously those places that we could class as slave societies, right? South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, etc. They're much less eager to arm enslaved people, particularly because enslaved people make up, in many cases, more than 50% of the population, and would very likely turn those arms not against the British, but against their own masters. Slave-owning elites recognize this. They believe that their entire way of life would be threatened by arming enslaved people. And it's their greatest fear throughout the war, that they won't be able to maintain their mastery, their dominance amid a broader continental war. So in many places with support unwelcomed by white Americans, several thousand enslaved people actually joined the British Army, which guaranteed their freedom if they abandoned their masters. And we read about this a little bit last week, right? We saw signs of it in Lord Dunmore's proclamation from November of 1775. And it's really essential to consider that that emancipationist episode wasn't merely caused by one very elite British figure signing a document, right? Instead, Dunmore was pushed into that decision by enslaved people themselves. And that's a theme we're going to come back to a lot for the next few weeks. Whenever we talk about enslaved people running away, when we talk about enslaved people joining the Union Army in the Civil War, when we talk about fugitive slaves in the 1850s, I want you to keep this idea in mind. Wherever emancipation happens, it's usually enslaved people, although they don't always show up in the primary sources in the documents, who are nudging, who are urging, or who are simply acting in ways that drive very powerful officials to embrace emancipation. And we see that with Lord Dunmore's proclamation. He issued it in November of 1775, but in April of 1775, he was visited by a group of enslaved people who told him if he would support them, they would escape and join his army and fight for him, right? So these were people who knew the landscape. They knew their masters very intimately. It was a real asset. but it wasn't something Dunmore could just think of on his own, right? It was African American people in particular who drove this proclamation. And the same was true as the war developed. Whenever Dunmore and his navy came near the coast, enslaved people understood that this was an opportunity for freedom and would flock to his navy. That's going to happen again during the Civil War, and we'll come back to that idea, right? Again, emancipating themselves. These are common people. These are people with very little social and political power or none, but they're managing to seize the moment and free themselves and force the hand of some of the most powerful people on the continent at the time. By the end of the war, about 15,000 African Americans had survived and fled the new United States with the British Army. Some of them went to the Caribbean and actually found themselves enslaved there once more in a sort of tragic and horrifying ending. Others went north to places like Nova Scotia in Canada and found themselves uncomfortably fitting there and unwelcome there. British colonies there were not willing to accept them. Some did successfully make lives in Britain or in other parts of Europe. And then some actually moved to Africa, the home of their ancestors, right? And set up communities in places like Sierra Leone with the help at times of the British government. It's important to remember that most of those people were not, and I'm going to come back to this idea in just a few minutes, but it's not like they were going back to Africa. In many cases, their ancestors had been pulled away from Africa a century or more before, right? And these folks, for the most part, had never been there before, but saw it still as a beacon, a place where they might achieve freedom once more. So this whole process of enslaved people emancipating themselves by allying with the British Army is something to kind of sit with and think about for a minute, just based on how we think about the American Revolution or how it's most popularly understood, right? Usually we associate really big, really vague, probably unhelpful terms and concepts with the Revolutionary War, and then we kind of move on, right? Freedom, the fight against tyranny, liberty, right? Those terms are effective for a certain telling of the revolution that wants us to think of it just as a story of heroes doing the right thing at the right time. And they're effective because they don't really mean anything unless they're really grounded in specific historical episodes. And most people don't follow up to ask how they are. And so it's a way of sort of propagandizing the past, right? But when we think about these 15,000 African American people that I just mentioned, the story of the Revolutionary War takes on a dramatically different cast, right? For them, the era inspired dreams of freedom too, but that freedom isn't in carving out independence from another national power. Instead, it is self-emancipation. And it's actually freedom from the country that's trying to achieve independence. Freedom from those who call themselves revolutionaries. It's sort of an upside down telling of the revolution based on how we normally understand it. And of course, 15,000, while a significant number of people, is actually a much smaller number than the number of enslaved people who did not manage to achieve emancipation during the war and found themselves still enslaved throughout the American Revolution and after the American Revolution. So for those people, the idea of liberty remained just a dream, if that, during this period. They did not enjoy freedom at the moment of its apparent birth in North America, I suppose you could say. What about the Constitution? And I'm not going to go into a deep sort of explanation of how we get from the American Revolution to the Constitution. If you're interested in that, I can recommend a very, very good free online textbook so you can brush up on all of that. But this is the document that serves as sort of a punctuation mark to the Revolutionary era. It turns these 13 disparate colonies into a single nation It creates the federal government as we understand it. And we saw a little bit last week how slavery plays a role in that document. We read some of its most relevant sections related to slavery. For example, we saw that the Constitution, which apportions representation in Congress and the Electoral College based on population, deemed enslaved people 3/5 of a person. This was a compromise, okay? It was not, I think this is a misunderstanding, and it's really important to get this right. It wasn't enslavers themselves, Southern enslavers, who declared their own property 3/5 of a person. Okay, that would not have served their self-interest. It wasn't just a way of sort of dehumanizing, although that's one of the effects of it. Right, Southern slaveholders wanted enslaved property counted as 5/5 of a person, right? 100% a person, because it would give them more power. It would raise their population and give them more representation in Congress. Instead, it was the representatives from non-slaveholding states or states with very small enslaved populations who wanted enslaved people to be counted as 0/5 of a person, right? Which would give them a population advantage. And so the two come together and they accept this compromise that it will be 3/5. We see as well that the Constitution set a timeline for the end of the importation of enslaved people, right? The banning of the transatlantic slave trade, at least into the United States. And we saw that the Constitution included a fugitive slave clause, right? A way of sort of managing relations between states that said if an enslaved person escapes from, say, Kentucky wasn't a state yet at the time, but let's say from Virginia into Pennsylvania, then Pennsylvania has to return that person, right? This is a constitutionally mandated relationship between states. Very little of this, as you could probably tell, had to do with ideals or any sort of grand notion of what is just or what is right. Again, we hear so much about the Constitution in our political culture. Every politician references the Constitution, our founding ideals, the founding fathers, and they tend to think about the men who were in that room in Philadelphia drafting this thing as like gods, right? They don't tend to think of those men as deeply enmeshed in real human life with real political interests and just trying to kind of combat one another over one another's self-interest, right? To get the best deal to bring home to their own state. But that's what it was, right? It was one big negotiation. And they were trying to do something very difficult, right? They're trying to create a single political union out of a stretch of land that encompasses some very different places. Vermont and South Carolina were at that convention together. Those are very different places with different interests. And as the historian Edward Baptist has put it, he's a historian of slavery, he said self-interest was the governing principle shaping the Constitution. And it's a lot of different competing self-interests that are at the table, which means there's not a great deal of humanitarian consideration for enslaved people. In fact, I would say there's definitely none, right? There's really no consideration of enslaved people's interests. They're not represented at the convention. There's no consideration of free African-American people's interests really either. They're not represented either. Instead, the kinds of self-interest that are represented at the Constitutional Convention come down to, as so many of these issues always do, to two things. The first one is profit, right? The profit of enslavers who wanted to preserve and maximize the value of their slave property, and political power is the other self-interest involved, namely the relative political power of enslavers versus non-slaveholders, or what is beginning to cleave into two sections, a slaveholding section and a non-holding slaveholding section, or states that are slave societies and states that are societies with slaves, right? These are competing factions struggling to advance their own self-interest, and the Constitution is merely the outcome of that. Okay, so it's not as sort of grand and idealistic as maybe we tend to think it is. And if you read the document, as you did a little bit last week, you'll quickly get that sense. So this is the end of the Revolutionary period, and we're moving more fully into this early national era and deepening some of the trends of the middle period of American slavery here. And after the Revolution, there's two great transformations that are going to radically alter African American life in these new United States. The first one is the initiation of slavery's demise in the societies with slaves of the North. Okay. Another way of thinking about this is the slow creation of what we think of as the free North. And I say what we think of because when we tend to talk about the Civil War era, as we will later in this class, we always say like the North was free and the South was slave. That was a process. The North became ostensibly free because of a series of laws that are passed to end slavery in those colonies. It varied from state to state. In general, between about 1777, in the middle of the Revolutionary War, and 1804, every state north of Maryland took steps to abolish slavery. In some cases, abolition was very swift. Vermont became the first region in all of the Americas to abolish slavery in 1777. A few years later, the Supreme Court of Massachusetts found slavery unconstitutional based on that state's constitution, which said that all people have a right to liberty and self-preservation. And so Massachusetts ended slavery in 1783. And the case we read last week, Elizabeth Freeman's case, is one of the foundational cases that Massachusetts Supreme Court looked at and said, well, based on the logic of this case, which grants this woman and another man their freedom, slavery really can't exist in Massachusetts. So it's kind of quick and easy in those two places. But here's the thing. Slavery was really, really uncommon in Massachusetts, and it was essentially non-existent in Vermont. In other words, I think it's important, and I say this as someone who comes from New England originally, it's important not to think about those early abolitionist processes as representative of like the inherent goodness of Vermont and Massachusetts. It's not like those states weren't self-interested places. Rather, amid the general passion of liberty that was the American Revolution, or the passion for liberty that was the Revolution, it was fairly easy for those two places to ban slavery as a sort of statement of broader values. There wasn't much on the line in doing that. There were slaveholders in Massachusetts and perhaps a couple in Vermont as well, but they didn't represent any significant political bloc that was going to stop that or threaten to overthrow the government if the government tried to do that. But in other northern states, it was harder. Abolition was more complicated. In many cases, these states chose not to end slavery outright, but to initiate a process called gradual emancipation. In general, that meant living enslaved people would not be freed, but their future children would achieve freedom at a certain age. Because of this drawn out process of emancipation, there were still enslaved people in northern states through the middle of the 19th century, even up to the time of the Civil War. So Connecticut, for example, like its neighbor Massachusetts, it began gradual emancipation in the 1780s. There were still enslaved people there through the 1840s. New Jersey instituted gradual emancipation in 1804, and there were still enslaved people there at the time of the American Civil War. The final emancipation happened in the 1860s. So this was a way of satisfying calls for abolition, right? Saying we're living up to our values, we're ending slavery, we're doing the thing that all of our revolutionary documents, all of our big rhetoric said we should do, but it also doesn't cause much political turmoil, right? Slaveholders are promised years, in some cases decades, more forced labor and ownership of other people. Um, it's kind of just a way to have it both ways, or an attempt to have it both ways. So the big picture here about Northern abolition, whether it was swift, as it was in a few cases, or gradual, as it was in most other cases, it required no real immediate economic sacrifice on the part of enslavers. So several historians have referred to this as philanthropy at bargain prices, right? It's easy to do the right thing when it doesn't cost you anything. Also, to be clear, even as gradual emancipation unfolded, formerly enslaved people did not suddenly become equal members of these societies, of the American political community. And in the weeks ahead, we're going to talk about the life of free blacks in the North during this period. And what we're going to see are a lot of patterns that will look familiar to us. In fact, it's the North, the northern states where slavery no longer exists or it's dying out, where widespread prejudice, overt racism, intense violence against free African Americans, segregation, these sorts of things are sort of being innovated. Again, we associate these with the South, most famously, right? The post-Civil War South, the Jim Crow South. But it was, in fact, the post-emancipation period in the North where so many of these things really took root and were sort of codified into law. And I think a big part of the reason for that has to do with some of the class dynamics that I was talking about last week. For the white working class in the northern states after the American Revolution, people who increasingly were sort of drawn into a global capitalist market, they're working to earn wages, they're living their lives on kind of a razor's edge. Free African Americans became an easy target for their vitriol, for their hatred of competition, economic competition. And it was important for many of these people for many of these sort of working class whites to assure themselves that they were not the bottom of the society. And there were many politicians perfectly happy to play into that dynamic if it advantaged them. So this is something to keep in mind. Abolition in the North is quickly followed by new frontiers in racial hatred. And again, just as African Americans had protested their enslavement during the Revolution, they protest these new waves of prejudice. They're very self-aware, recognizing that they have to stand up for themselves and their place in the political community. So this is a resistance to racism and not just slavery. Consider, for example, a petition. This is actually from 1780. It's still during the Revolutionary period, but it's by a group of free black men in Massachusetts. Among them, Paul Cuffey is probably the most famous. He's one of the wealthiest people in the northern states by the early 19th century. He was a brilliant sort of shipping magnate, entrepreneur, and he was a black man. And he and his brother and several others, they write to the state of Massachusetts, and they criticize the state for taxing them equal to their white neighbors, despite having once held them and their ancestors as slaves, right? So what they're saying is the state of Massachusetts allowed us, in some cases, and certainly our ancestors in every case, to be held as slaves. It is unfair for that same state to tax us equivalently to those whose ancestors were not held as slaves. And why is that unfair? Because part of wealth in this society is inherited. But our ancestors were not given wages. They were not given an opportunity to own property. They were completely excluded from the political community. That is basic. That is a basic violation of our economic rights. Okay. Here's what they wrote specifically. and I edited this a bit for clarity. They write, "We, by reason of hard slavery, have been deprived of enjoying the profits of our labor, as our neighbors, the white people, do. Yet, we now are taxed both in our polls and that small pittance of estate which, through much hard labor and industry, we have got together to sustain ourselves." And then they later go on to write that this condition has been especially difficult for Black people who fought for the state of Massachusetts during the American Revolution itself. This is extremely relevant criticism, and I mean relevant for the year 2020, right? This is going back long. This is almost a decade before the U.S. Constitution was ratified. These guys are advancing arguments that are very similar in kind to what activists today are saying, right? They're saying historical injustice creates contemporary inequality, and that has to be recognized and addressed, or else you're perpetuating the injustice. Specifically, they're arguing they are willing to carry the burdens of citizenship, the burdens of citizenship that many of us have had to carry, taxes, as well as military service, extraordinary military service. But they're not willing to do that without equally enjoying the fruits of citizenship, right? Namely, equal ability to earn a living, to support yourself, to pass your wealth on to your own children, to vote, right? You can't expect the sacrifice unless there is some sort of benefit, unless there is some sort of privilege for being a member of this political community. This is what they're saying. And again, I think it's an incredibly relevant argument today, and it remains a relevant argument all through the history of African Americans in the United States since 1780. So, amid this process of gradual emancipation in the North, it at first seems like this is going to happen in the South too. In Virginia, declining revenues for tobacco planters led many to further question the need for enslaved laborers. The soil's dying out in Virginia, it's exhausting. Tobacco is sort of drying up as a revenue stream, and many people are beginning to question, well, if we said all this stuff about freedom, liberty, and if it's not that profitable anyway, is this really something we want to continue doing? And many slaveholders were scared because there was another revolution. This one occurred in the French Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue, and it suggested that enslaved people could overthrow the enslaver classes. Now there was precedent for this happening, right? And this is what comes to be known as the Haitian Revolution. There's three great revolutions in the late 18th century in the Atlantic world. Of course, there's the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution, all too often overlooked in mainstream curriculum, which is absurd. Certainly Americans at the time did not overlook the Haitian Revolution. It was the first successful revolution of enslaved people. And it was the first example in the world of enslaved people forming an independent nation. And they called their independent nation Haiti. Southern slaveholders, this is not far, right? This is not that far from the mainland United States. And in the world, the Atlantic world of the 18th century, the Caribbean is the sort of next door neighbor of the early United States. So it's like on your doorstep is how slaveholders think about it. In the wake of the Haitian Revolution, they're thinking about this enormous episode. They're thinking about how many enslaved people joined the British during the American Revolution, and they're coming to view enslaved people as a so-called enemy within. This was a term that was commonly used. Potential rebels in their fields, in their kitchens, in their bedrooms, and they become sort of obsessed with the idea that such an uprising could come at any moment. And they're going to remain obsessed and terrified of this more or less until slavery ends, by the way. And they're going to develop all manner of ways to oppress and surveil the enslaved population to make sure such an event doesn't occur, although it does in some small ways at various points. But in the immediate aftermath of the Haitian Revolution, to prevent similar rebellion at home, a number of Virginia planters manumitted or freed their enslaved property. That process, along with emancipation in the North, meant that there's this growing free Black population in the early United States. It's rising steadily in the post-revolutionary years. And that population makes a number of observers, including probably most famously Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, right, two American presidents, conclude that free African Americans could not remain in the United States if they were not enslaved, right? African Americans could only really exist in the U.S. as slaves. So if Southern slave societies were to end slavery, they would have to adopt a scheme called colonization. And what that meant was sending former slaves to Africa, creating colonies, American colonies, and settling them with formerly enslaved people. Even though almost all of these people had been born in North America, and very few of them had actually ever set foot in Africa. Eventually, this idea leads to the formation of what was called the American Colonization Society. And eventually that society founds a country, or at least a colony at first. It later becomes an independent nation called Liberia in West Africa, and that nation still exists. And its capital is Monrovia, named for President James Monroe, who was president at the time that Liberia was founded. Colonization sort of masqueraded as a humanitarian principle. Colonizationists thought of themselves as trying to save the formerly enslaved population, as well as save the United States from social and political turmoil that would come from having a multiracial political community. Obviously, it wasn't that, though, right? It was fundamentally grounded in racist ideas. The belief that Black and white people could only coexist if one of those groups was dominant and the other completely oppressed, right, enslaved. Without slavery to suppress the Black community, many elites were dreaming of simply banishing the problem, right? They can't imagine another way to incorporate all of these people into their society. The only alternative was social unrest and violence, etc. This is going back to this idea that we talked about last week when we talked about colonial slavery, early colonial slavery. What many colonizationists were afraid of, truly afraid of, was class conflict. And they were afraid that formerly enslaved people would find themselves aligned with poor whites, right? This is exactly the thing going back to Bacon's Rebellion, going back to the Virginia colony. And that you would have a large multiracial working class that challenged elite dominance. Colonization is an attempt to suppress that sort of development, as well as other things. I mean, and of course, they genuinely believed as well, as true racists, that white and Black just simply couldn't coexist. But there was a class benefit to those two groups not coexisting. So to sum up this first transformation, during and immediately after the Revolution, we have the abolition of slavery in some states, we have gradual emancipation in others, we have rising population of free African Americans throughout the North and in some southern regions. So let's move to the second transformation, which was the rapid expansion of slavery in the South and the West. And when I speak of the West, basically for the rest of this class, what I mean is the region west of the Appalachian Mountains, extending from, so let's say we're focusing on the South, extending from the western border of like the Carolinas and Georgia out to Texas, Missouri, right, just beyond the Mississippi River. This process accelerated a little later than that first that I just talked about. Really, it was around the turn of the 19th century, so now we're getting into the 1800s, that this really picks up steam. And I think a good way to just jump into it is to think about a few numbers. Between 1676, the year of Bacon's Rebellion, and 1776, the year of the Declaration of Independence, it's a century, obviously, the slave population in mainland North America grew to about 500,000 people, 500,000 people. That's 100 years, 500,000 people. Between 1776 and 1820, which is 44 years, and I wrote 46 there. I promise that it's 44. I don't know what I was thinking. The enslaved population of the United States grew from 500,000 to 1.5 million, a 1 million person gain in the generation following the American Revolution. 1 million more enslaved people after the Revolution than before. And this sets the stage for a final population surge between 1820 and 1860, which is not on this slide, but in that period, the US enslaved population grew from 1.5 million to 4 million. Okay, it absolutely explodes in those years. And what we're talking about for the next few minutes will give you a foundation for understanding that kind of population growth. Much of this population was in the West, not in the older slave societies of, say, the Chesapeake or South Carolina. This was beyond the Appalachians, where in the 30 years after the American Revolution, after the Constitution was ratified, there are 6 new slave states added to the United States. Those are Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Missouri. And the most important single engine driving this expansion of the enslaved population was the emergence of short staple cotton culture. Right? That is the widespread cultivation of a crop that fueled the Industrial Revolution, the most important crop in modern world history and one of the most important commodities, certainly in the history of the world. U.S. production of cotton was 3,000 bales in 1790. It's extremely small. It is a sort of marginal product, marginal export of the new United States. By 1840, so 50 years later, 1.35 million bales of cotton is coming out of the United States. And facilitating this change was the American government's conquest of Western land and its forced removal and outright extermination and murder of native communities who were already on those lands that were particularly well suited to cotton culture. So again, when I'm talking about the West right now, that's the region we think of as the Deep South. Okay, so this is a really critical point. And one of the big ideas that if you were to walk away from this class with anything, I'd hope it was this. The expansion of Black slavery was always dependent on the dispossession, the forced migration, and in some cases, the extermination of Native people. Okay, these aren't just like two independent tragedies that happen to happen on the same continent or in the same country, although we tend to group our histories in the United States by identity groups. So, oh, here's American Indian history, and here's African American history. But you can't really understand one without the other, especially in this crucial point. These are codependent processes. Historians have long, and not necessarily wrongly, emphasized the cotton gin. And I'm sure many of you learned about the cotton gin, Eli Whitney's invention in the 1790s of this little device that can pull the seeds out of short staple cotton, and said that's why the cotton revolution happened, because we had this cool device. That's fine. Okay, that's not necessarily wrong, but by emphasizing a white man's entrepreneurship, right, by positioning a white man's genius as the central event that explains the cotton boom, we are badly overlooking the fact that the cotton boom happened on land, right? This revolution in the American economy required a vast territory, and that land had to be violently conquered by settlers backed by the United States military. And that's how you have a cotton revolution, right? It's not just a smart guy in Connecticut who develops a little device. In the 1830s alone, and I know this is a little bit outside the temporal boundaries of this lecture, some 80,000 native people, Creeks, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Seminoles, Cherokees, were cleared from their homelands to make way for enslaved African Americans, right? That's who follows. When we think of the Trail of Tears, I think sometimes we forget that other people followed onto that land, and it was enslaved people, forced to move onto that land and turn that land into some of the world's most valuable real estate. As the historian Claudio Sant has argued, native expulsion was the war the slaveholders won, right? If the Civil War is the war they lost, this process, this war of extermination and dispossession, was the one that they won. This was a slaveholder-driven process, okay? It's essential to walk away from this class with that idea. These overlapping processes, the creation of the United States as an independent country, which could use its power to drive Native people away from what we now think of as the Deep South. The invention of technology that could make it easier to process short staple cotton. All of these things made large-scale cotton production possible, and they made the massive growth of Black enslavement to some extent inevitable. These are extremely grim developments that follow immediately after the American Revolution. And the new United States was completely changed by them. Remember, Virginia enslavers, even as late as 1800, are thinking, maybe we'll just get rid of slavery, right? They're flirting with colonization. They're afraid of the Haitian Revolution. After the developments I've just described, though, that is not going to happen. By the end of this middle period, around the year 1820, enslaved African Americans were producing 75% of the world's cotton supply. 75% of all cotton in the world is coming from American slaves. And it's fueling the Industrial Revolution in Britain and in the northeastern United States. In other words, enslaved African Americans were, in this period, the most important workers on earth, okay? They are the most important figures in the global economy, and there's no way that their enslavers are going to let them go. They're enslavers, by the way, who are now among the wealthiest people on earth and the most powerful, politically powerful people on earth. There's no way that they're going to willingly end slavery. Nor, by the way, is there any chance that industrialists in places like Lowell, Massachusetts, or Birmingham, England, industrialists in these sorts of places are going to not support slavery, right? They're benefiting from it as well. The entire global economy is changing, and it's largely because of these processes of native dispossession and African American enslavement. I said at the beginning of this class, and I just want to say it again, the things we're talking about here are not side stories to some bigger thing. African American history is the sort of backbone of American history. Native American history is as well, and they are deeply intertwined. Okay, I'm going to come off my soapbox a little bit here. By the end of the middle period of slavery, and by the end of this early national period in the United States, we've got a few major changes that I'll sum up for you now. First, we have an increasingly divided country by slave South and free North. Okay, it's easy to overstate the division. There's a lot of people who don't really see a division there and are perfectly happy for these two to coexist, but it's there and it's going to get worse. It's going to get more intense over time, and we'll deal with all of that down the road. Second, cotton is the central economic engine of Southern life without question, but also of national economic life. By 1803, was the nation's leading export, and it would remain that through the Civil War. So for the next 57 years, right, it's basically a lifetime in the 19th century. It's kind of a long lifetime in the 19th century. It will remain the nation's leading export, and all political questions will go through the people who benefit most from this, right? The enslavers in the Cotton Empire will become the most powerful people in the country. Third, the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed, and in its place emerges an active domestic slave trade, right? So maybe the framers of the Constitution, if we're in our most generous mood, we could say they thought by banning the transatlantic slave trade, slavery would slowly die out, and they wouldn't have to actually make a decision about the issue. It would take care of itself, right? And they did feel that way to some extent. But something unintended happened, which is Americans just started buying and selling enslaved people amongst themselves. And we have an extremely vibrant, extremely lucrative and large and long domestic slave trade that develops. And it's known as the Second Middle Passage. So if the Middle Passage is the journey from West Africa to the Americas, the horrible months-long journey that the first generation of enslaved people suffered through for centuries, the Second Middle Passage is by foot, often, sometimes by steamboat as well. And it's the journey from the upper South to the lower South. That is, enslavers in places like Virginia and Maryland who are moving away from slavery, they begin selling enslaved people to cotton planters further south through the slave markets of cities like New Orleans or Charleston, things like that. And you're going to see this in 12 Years a Slave too. We have good examples of this Second Middle Passage. By 1800, or between rather 1800 and the 1860s, thousands of slave coffles made their way from the upper South down to the newly opening territories of the deep South. A coffle is a forced march, a chain of people chained together. So here are a few numbers to help you make sense of how large this forced migration was. As you can see, between 1800 and 1860, 213,000 people are forcibly migrated, moved into Alabama, 234,000 into Mississippi, 127,000 into Texas, 124,000 Louisiana. And I put South Carolina on here just as an example of the states that were losing enslaved population. South Carolina, Virginia, similar. Kentucky eventually becomes similar. Upper South or coastal states that found it more profitable, more lucrative to sell enslaved people rather than to hold on to them and work them as slaves. Obviously, that doesn't mean slavery disappeared in those places. It just got a little bit smaller as the populations boomed elsewhere. All of this brings back up the idea of commodification. And here's some images of coffles, by the way. South Carolina, Virginia, they're not, as I said, they're not giving up on slavery. They're just profiting in new ways on Black people's bodies, right? Those bodies were as important to the American economy as the cotton that they produced. Enslaved people were in fact the most highly valued form of property in the United States aside from land itself, okay? There is hundreds of millions of dollars tied up in these people's bodies. In short, more enslaved people, just to wrap this up, experienced forced internal migration during the generation after the American Revolution than there were enslaved people in the entire country at the time of the Revolution, right? There's 500,000 enslaved people in 1776. More than that suffer through this domestic slave trade, this Second Middle Passage. Again, I just want to re-emphasize this idea. The country is literally building itself, right? It's populating the West. It's enriching itself on cotton. It's literally building itself through the twin institutions of first Indian dispossession and second black enslavement, essential. In this sense, if we scale back and we think about what's happening here, slave coffles like the ones you're looking at here were like human links, right? They were human, they were chains of people that literally linked or bound distant places like Texas and Virginia into a single Southern identity, a single slave society, the largest slave society the world had ever known. But they were also human links binding the new United States. This is the sort of the agent that holds the country together, is the slave coffle of the domestic slave trade. And this is the last thing I'll say about this, but I want you to keep in mind as we move into this week's readings, the domestic slave trade had another secondary gain. And that was enslavers could use the threat of sale as a form of terror to coerce enslaved people to do the work that was expected of them, right? Enslavers, after the middle period, they don't really need extreme violence to get what they want like they used to. And in fact, they try to err on the side of caution and not use extreme violence because they don't want to damage what is their property, right? As grim as that is. Instead, they could simply say you will be sold, or your child will be sold, or your wife will be sold, and you will literally never see them again. And that was terror enough to get what they wanted. As one enslaver put it in 1838, I governed my plantation without the whip by stating to them that I should sell them if they do not conduct themselves as I wish. Okay, so there it is. The secondary gain of the second middle passage. Okay, one more just quick thing to sum up. Fourth, the pervasive revolutionary language, the rhetoric of the American Revolution, of emancipation and liberty, as well as the rhetoric of the Haitian Revolution. That didn't go away. It haunted enslavers throughout the rest of slavery's history in the United States. Enslaved people throughout the New World were aware of this rhetoric. They used it, they dreamed of it, they thought about it constantly. They took note of the ideological importance of the American Revolution, of the Haitian Revolution, and it altered the dynamics of master-slave relations. And it also created among free blacks in the North, as well as some free blacks who lived in the slave societies of the South, a sort of dream of liberty, true liberty. Okay, let's just quickly wrap up with two concepts that I'm just going to review as fast as I can. I know this is kind of a long lecture for you all. Paternalism, and these are just going to kind of help you get a sense of what life was like on the ground on plantations. So paternalism is a term that comes up a lot in slavery studies. What that means is that it's a sort of way that enslavers portrayed themselves relative to their slave property. They don't think of themselves as competitive capitalists trying to gain an advantage over their workers. Okay, they think of themselves generously. They think of themselves as sort of lords, right? Gentlemen who are responsible for taking care of their family, and their family includes their enslaved property. So we call this outlook paternalism. It's a justification of slavery, right? It's a way of saying that African descended people are simply not capable of taking care of themselves, and they require the protection and care of the slaveholder, of the enslaver. It is also a way to hide the brutal realities of slavery. It's a way to hide, for example, that threat of sale. The fact that enslavers might threaten a mother with the sale of her child. Paternalism is a way to hide those kind of ugly realities. Here's how The historian Eugene Genovese wrote about this. He's sort of the historian most famous for coining this idea. He wrote, for slaveholders, paternalism represented an attempt to overcome the fundamental contradiction of slavery, the impossibility of the slaves ever becoming the things they were supposed to be, free people, right? Independent human beings. Paternalism defined the involuntary labor of the slaves as a legitimate return for their master's protection and direction, right? So in the paternalist mindset, enslavement isn't a punishment, right? It is a gift. It's a gift that the master extends to his enslaved property in return for their work, their labor. Of course, enslavers could only retain their so-called families, right? The enslaved people that they called their family, with force, especially with the threat of sale, right? So this is the contradiction. This is the absurdity of enslavers' paternalism. It's like a guise that covers up the realities of what's happening here. And it's a very convenient way after slavery ends in the Civil War of looking back with nostalgia and saying it was better times when we had slavery and everyone was better off, right? You can hearken back to paternalist logic. And the last term I want to bring up is resistance. And this is something we're going to talk a lot about for the rest of the class. This is essential, right? Just as enslaved people resisted their slavery during the Revolution and in Saint-Domingue during the Haitian Revolution, they resisted their enslavement throughout the middle period and all the way up to and during the American Civil War. And it could take different forms. It took the form of open, violent rebellion at times. The most famous was Nat Turner's Rebellion in Virginia. It's in 1831. Nat Turner, an enslaved man, gathers a group of other enslaved people. They murder several dozen people throughout their town. Eventually, that rebellion was put down, but it terrified people all across the country, white people all across the country. Other instances of resistance could include like individual acts of violence, raising a fist to a master, pushing someone, poisoning someone, assaulting someone somehow, right? Most commonly, though, resistance took more sort of subtle more subtle manifestations, and it wove itself into everyday life. It could take the form of a song that intended to communicate a message. It could take the form of subtle networks of communication, which you'll probably notice some hints of this in your runaway advertisements that you read. It could take the form of intentionally sabotaging or slowing down work to control the conditions of work. If an enslaved person is being sold, it could take the form of sabotaging the sale somehow, right? By complaining of illness or making oneself ill intentionally to try and drop their value and prevent their master from selling them. All that means is that enslavers' domination, although significant, was never ever complete. Enslaved people retained some control over their lives, and it depends on their specific situation, just how much they were able to control. The relationship between enslavers and enslaved was unequal, but it was still a relationship. It was one that was constantly under negotiation. It's a constant dialectic of power. Here's how Harriet Jacobs, who escaped her enslavement in North Carolina, put it in the narrative of her life. She said, "My master had power and law on his side. I had a determined will." Right? She still had cards in her hand that she could play, is what she's saying, despite the enormous power and authority that enslavers maintained in the United States, the new United States. Okay, thanks for watching. I know this was kind of a long one. This is probably the longest one of the semester, and I look forward to talking more about this with all of you.